I'm going to have to cut them off at 6 minutes. We're running very short of time. Neil Findlay, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
I wish you had done that with some previous speakers, Presiding Officer. For so many of our people, the day-to-day realities of life are not just tough or uncomfortable, but desperately grim, with little immediate prospect of improvement. And in my own region, jobs are being lost on a daily basis, with Halls being the most alarming example. But this week, another 70 jobs were lost in West Lothian alone as a result of the closure of Blockbuster and HMV. And the spectre of welfare reform, in my opinion, the most vindictive piece of legislation in decades, haunts our communities. And it's no exaggeration to say that this will be the cause of people losing their homes, their marriages, and we know, tragically for some people, their lives. We see wages frozen or at best cut, and pension contributions rising with no benefit to those who pay them. The Scottish Government will say all of this has nothing to do with them. And of course, yes, welfare reform is a Westminster issue, and austerity is not at the moment, is the policy being driven by the dark forces of the coalition government in London. In fact, maybe this is an opportune time for Mr Rennie.
Just wonder whether Mr Findlay accepts any responsibility for what's happened since they left power. Any responsibility at all?
Neil Findlay.
I think all parties have a responsibility for the situation we're in, because we all tolerated the global financial system that brought us to our knees, and we all said not a lot about it. But, Presiding Officer, there are things that can be done here, and there are still political choices to be made. Unfortunately, all too often, the Scottish Government is making the wrong choices, and all the while blaming it on someone else, because this is part of the referendum game plan. For example, we have the public sector wage freeze. That's their policy. It's their policy choice, as is the council tax policy, which is crippling essential local government services. And we see the disgraceful comments of the Health Secretary, blaming councils on cuts that are a direct consequence of the decisions that he is making in government. As far as the NHS is concerned, we know there are job losses and reductions in staff, pressures to meet targets because of the diminishing staff numbers, shown quite self-evidently by the waiting time scandal and a whole host of other complaints. We see a cherished institution under extreme pressure, yet the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister repeat the line, the NHS is performing better than ever, patient satisfaction, not at a moment. You wouldn't take any intervention, so I think you should sit down. Patient satisfaction is at record levels, staff are happier, and there are more of them. Presiding Officer, it just does not reflect the real world. What about housing? In Scotland we have a housing crisis. Sofa surfing is becoming the norm for young people. Far too many children and families are homeless, and people can't access mortgages because they don't have a deposit, and they can't access social housing because they don't have the points and the houses are not available. Yet the Minister will tell us they're building more houses than ever, that waiting lists and homelessness are down and that standards are rising. This, again, does not reflect the real world and the real political choices the government is making. The housing budget was cut by 86 million in real terms. Presiding Officer, the government could have chosen to tackle the housing crisis and at the same time create demand in the economy by putting additional money into housing, but they chose not to. And what about education? The Scottish Government has cut funding in our college sector at the very time we need colleges most. These cuts have led to cuts in jobs, courses and places. Labour's political choice is to support our colleges, to provide our young people with the tools they need to gain employment. And as Mr McIntosh said, we would reinstate the entire funding cut to our colleges, replacing the 34 million that has been taken from them.
Mark MacDonald.
The member has outlined a number of areas where he would want to see increased funding, and he's put figures on some of that. Would you be willing to identify where he would therefore take that money away from in order to fund those increases?
I won't waste any further time in my speech because Mr McIntosh already did that. This would also prevent redundancies, and it would prevent the cuts to courses for women and people with learning disabilities. And, Presiding Officer, let's not hear any of the tired, lazy lines from the government backbenchers about being negative and talking down Scotland, because this is the reality for many of their fellow citizens, and they want us to reflect that and not appear detached from the world that they live in. And no amount of spin and bluster from ministers, no amount of sycophantic planted questions from backbenchers or cheerleading speeches from the people behind the Finance Secretary will hide that.
Last minute.
So in addition to replacing the college budget, Mr Swinney, we ask you to invest in housing through the Barnett Consequentials and, as Mr McIntosh has explained, kick-starting construction and creating jobs. And we would also ask to reinstate the cuts to the Egypt project through the borrowing against the regulated asset base to pay for projects like the Dalmeny Cord in my area, which would stimulate developments like Winsporough Station in the core development area where it lies. These are practical steps that we could take. Unemployment, colleges, construction, housing and transport, these are our political priorities, and I believe they're the people's priorities. It's just a shame they're not the government's priorities.
Thank you.